I've always loved birds. Their freedom, their grace, their endless variety. Even as a child, I'd sit for hours on the porch with a battered pair of binoculars, watching sparrows flit through the trees and crows gather in ominous councils on the telephone wires. It wasn't until this past year that I began to understand the price of my fascination. It started innocently enough. I'd moved to a small rural town for some peace and quiet after the chaos of city life. The house was old but charming, perched on the edge of a sprawling forest. It came with a rickety bird feeder hanging from the porch, which I promptly refilled. Within days, the yard was alive with activity: blue jays, robins, even the occasional cardinal. I felt a quiet pride watching them, as if I'd become part of some secret society of nature enthusiasts. But then the crows came. At first, it was just one or two, their glossy black feathers gleaming like oil slicks in the sunlight. They'd perch on the feeder, scattering the smaller birds, with harsh caws and pecking aggressively at the seed. I didn't mind; they had as much right to the food as any other bird. But their numbers grew. 5, 10, 20. Soon, the feeder was a constant mass of black wings and sharp beaks. The smaller birds stopped coming altogether. I'd heard stories about crows being clever, even vengeful, but I'd never thought much of it. Still, something about their unblinking stares began to unsettle me. Whenever I stepped onto the porch, they'd all turn to look at me in eerie unison. Their caws grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something. I laughed it off. They're just birds, I told myself. What harm could they do? One night, I woke to a strange tapping sound. Groggy, I stumbled out of bed and peered through the window. The moonlight illuminated a sea of black shapes on the lawn. Crows. Hundreds of them. They covered the yard like a living carpet, their heads bobbing as they pecked at the ground. The tapping noise came from a crow perched on the windowsill, its beak rapping rhythmically against the glass. I shooed it away, but it didn't budge. Instead, it tilted its head and fixed me with one obsidian eye. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Finally, I banged on the window with enough force to startle it, and it flew off with an angry screech. The others followed, their wings making a sound like dry leaves in a strong wind. The next morning, the yard was eerily quiet. The crows were gone, but they'd left something behind: small objects scattered across the porch. Shiny things, bottle caps, bits of foil, even a child's marble. It felt like an offering, though for what, I couldn't say. I gathered the trinkets and tossed them into a box, unsettled but unsure what else to do. Over the next few days, the crows' behavior grew more bizarre. They'd line up along the porch railing, watching me as I went about my day. If I ventured into the yard, they'd follow, always keeping their distance, but never letting me out of their sight. At night, the tapping at the window returned, more insistent this time. I started sleeping with earplugs, but even that couldn't block out the faint rustling of wings. One evening, I decided to confront them. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, I stepped onto the porch and shouted into the dark. "What do you want?" My voice sounded small even to me. "Leave me alone." The crows didn't move. They just stared, their eyes glinting like tiny mirrors in the flashlight beam. Then, as one, they took off, their wings beating in perfect synchrony. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap. I stumbled back inside, my heart pounding. That night, the dream started. I'd find myself in a vast, empty field, the sky above me choked with swirling black shapes. The crows would descend, their cries filling my ears until I woke, gasping for air. In one dream, a single crow landed in front of me and spoke in a voice like grinding stones, "Leave the forest." I tried to ignore it, but the warnings became impossible to dismiss. Dead animals began appearing on my doorstep: mice, rabbits, even a stray cat. Always the same, their eyes plocked out, their bodies unnervingly pristine otherwise. The air around the house grew heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Desperate, I turned to the locals for answers. Most just laughed, dismissing my concerns as the ramblings of an overactive imagination. But one old man, his face lined like tree bark, grew serious when I mentioned the crows. "They're watching you," he said, his voice low. "You've done something to upset them." "What could I have done?" I asked, bewildered. He shook his head. "It's not what you've done, it's what you've taken." The trinkets. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt. Could that be it? I'd thrown them away weeks ago, but maybe the crows had seen it as a slight. That night, I went to the trash pile behind the house and dug through the refuse until I found the box. It was damp and foul-smelling, but the objects inside were intact. I placed them on the porch, arranging them as neatly as I could, and whispered an apology to the darkness. For a while, it seemed to work. The crows kept their distance, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I began to sleep again, the dreams fading like morning mist. But the sense of unease never fully left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside the house. Then, one morning, I woke to find a new object on the porch, a small, intricately carved figurine of a bird, its eyes inlaid with tiny, glimmering stones. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside. That night, the tapping returned. Louder, more frantic. When I went to the window, the sight made my blood run cold. The yard was filled with crows, more than I'd ever seen. They pressed against the house, their beaks striking the walls and windows in a cacophony of sound. In the center of the swarm stood a figure, barely human, its body shrouded in feathers, its face obscured by a bird-like mask. The dreams returned, darker and more vivid. The figure appeared in each one, its voice a rasping whisper. "You belong to us now." I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The crows are relentless, their numbers growing by the day. I've tried to leave, but every time I step outside, the air turns thick and unbreathable, and the crows block my path. The figurine sits on the mantel, its eyes gleaming like tiny black holes, and I swear I've seen it move when I'm not looking. I've stopped refilling the feeder. It doesn't matter. The crows don't need an excuse anymore. They're always there, watching, waiting. I've started to wonder if they ever meant to let me go, or if I've been theirs from the start.